So hello everyone, welcome to this talk about digital technologies for the future cemetery. I'll kick off with a quick introduction of myself. I'll kick up with an acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, as the traditional owners of the land from which I'm speaking today. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be listening or who may watch this at a later date. So I am Dr. Fraser Allison. That doctor is freshly minted. It's only officially come in a few weeks ago. I'm a research fellow on the Future Cemetery project, which I'll be describing to you. Member of the School of Computing and Information Systems, the Human-Computer Interaction Group here, and the DeathTech research team, which I'll tell you a little bit about. I have a fairly eclectic mix of research interests, all kind of broadly in the human-computer interaction space. My PhD work was on games research, specifically the use of voice interaction, voice interfaces in digital games. But quite a different topic today. I'm talking about the space of memorial technologies. Got a little bit of feedback from someone, so maybe just please mute your microphone. Yes, so as I said, the DeathTech research team, of which I am a member, is an interdisciplinary team of scholars, mainly at the University of Melbourne. We have one member at the University of Oxford. The members are social scientists, anthropologists, human-computer interaction specialists, and media scholars who study the intersection of death and technology, and have been doing so across the team for, I believe, more than 10 years at this point. The sort of historical background to this work really came out of an initial body of work on the phenomenon of digital commemoration. So that's everything from something like when a social media account is turned into a legacy account because the person who owned it has died, to the overlap of Instagram and kind of selfie culture at funerals and other memorial events, to things like when people in an online virtual world, an online multiplayer game, for example, host funerals within the game space for people that they know in that space. So that's kind of the world of that work is very much about the kind of the digital phenomena of commemoration. And then more recently, the team has looked at new technologies in a more kind of physical vein, new and emerging technologies for the disposal of human bodies after they've died. Everyone knows the big two methods for disposing of human bodies, which are burial and cremation, but there are some issues or objections to those, some of which I'll talk about. And so there are a range of kind of interesting competing approaches that are starting to emerge. If you'd like to know more about either of those projects, here are two books that you may wish to read. Today I am talking about the Future Cemetery project. So this is the third Australian Research Council funded project that the team has undertaken. The focus of this project is to investigate the potential of new technologies to be incorporated into Australian cemeteries and memorial spaces. We're also looking at examples from around the world as well. With the aim of kind of working towards an understanding of how future cemeteries can make sensitive use of technologies to enhance their services to visitors and to the broader community as well. Now, I need to acknowledge that this work, as well as being funded by the Australian Research Council, is also funded by the Greater Metropolitan Cemeteries Trust, which is a non-profit organisation that manages around about half of the cemeteries in Melbourne. So thank you to them for their support. I'm not going to go into great detail about the research methods. I'm essentially going to pull out a few insights and findings, but just to kind of give a survey at the start of the methods by which what I'll talk about has come about. A range of approaches that we're drawing on here, some ethnographic work, going to funeral industry conventions, visiting and talking to people who work at cemeteries, crematoria, a range of people kind of in the industry, holding more structured formal workshops with people in the industry, which by the way is called the death care industry, much like the healthcare industry, there is a death care industry. Interviews and focus groups with those people and with other community members, some surveys, which I'll share a bit later, and some design analysis of existing cemetery technologies from around the world. And so the first thing I will lay out is what have we found are the big challenges that cemeteries are facing in the 21st century over the next 100 years. I'll show you a map here that we put together through the first industry workshop that we ran a little over a year ago with people in the death care industry, with academics, with government representatives, to understand, what is it that, why is it important for us to be looking at cemeteries and considering what they need to do? One of the really big stories in this space is demographic change, and particularly the increasing and aging population. So I think I've got a couple of graphs next. These are UN population projections based on ABS data. Now, everyone knows that the population of Australia is going up and that it is getting older. Life expectancy is going up, but as we have more and more older Australians in particular making up a higher proportion of the population, somewhat counterintuitively perhaps, the death rate is actually set to go up substantially over the coming decades, which you can see in this left-hand side graph, peaking sort of in about 60 years or so. So that's the death rate, the deaths per unit of population. And then also the sort of the raw total number of deaths is increasing massively. It has already, the number of people who die each year in Australia has already doubled since around about 1960. And over the next 50 years or so, it's going to double again, and it's going to keep on climbing. This is all happening at the same time as our cities are becoming more dense, more populated, and as land is becoming harder to come by, as the property market shows. And so this raises some real challenges for kind of the use of space for cemeteries and memorial purposes. To illustrate that, there was a report that came out last year, the Cemeteries and Crematoria Act 2013 statutory review for New South Wales, that looked at the status of the provision of cemetery space in Sydney in particular. And what this graph is showing is a projection that within about the next decade, the demand for burial space within metropolitan Sydney is going to have essentially no supply left, no space left to bury people. And as the demand is projected to keep going up, that presents a clear problem. What do you then do with people who want or need to be buried, or to have their family members buried? Do they have to then be buried far outside the city, with the consequence that people can't actually visit, so forth? So this is a real pressing problem. So as I've been talking about, there's a land supply issue that cemeteries are facing. There are legislative issues around being able to respond to that, which we look at a little bit, but I'll set aside for now. So economic implications, as more and more graves are being maintained. In many states, they need to be maintained in perpetuity, which is sort of indefinitely, and then the costs keep going up and up. So how are we paying for those? At the same time, the perceived relevance, the perceived connection to cemeteries and memorial practices in general is under some challenges. The big story of the kind of religious space in Australia, if you look across the censuses over the past decades, is the growth of the no religion grouping, particularly younger Australians. It is the single biggest kind of religious group, so to speak, is people with no religion, and that appears to be growing and growing as it's particularly strong with younger Australians. At the same time, there are also fast-growing minority religions and cultural groups, which mean that the diversity of cultural traditions that a cemetery needs to serve is getting much wider and sort of more complex. So that's another challenge that our contacts, our research participants talked about. And one of the consequences of that is that visitation to cemeteries is falling. So that can be a consequence of both that issue, maybe people are not, perhaps the sort of the cultural changes might be changing the way that people relate to the cemeteries, the relevance it has in their lives, if these are rooted in perhaps Christian traditions in many cases, in many family histories. And at the same time, because cemeteries might need to be further and further away from where people live, it's also harder to get to a loved one's gravesite, and so on and so forth. On top of all of that is the diaspora question. More and more Australians, as in places around the world, are moving to live elsewhere. They have family spread around the world. So the idea that there is a local cemetery that houses your family going back generations and you have that connection to that one specific place, you can go and visit, that's just not the reality for many people. And certainly that's the case for myself, for example. My grandfather, first of all, is that my mother's side of the family is from New Zealand, so I only kind of get over to see them every now and then. And then my grandfather died before I was born in Malaysia, in the Malaya emergency. He was an Air Force commander. And so I have never been to see his cemetery plot. And so this is the sort of thing that more and more people are encountering. There are a number of other challenges, which I won't go into, that we also identified through this research. And one of the really striking things about this map of the challenges that cemeteries face is that these problems are all interconnected. This is a very quick gloss on how one issue on the map is affecting other issues and driving that up and then leading to other things. There could be many more arrows. So broadly speaking, the future cemetery work, which I'll talk about, is kind of mostly addressing this top layer of considerations, some of which I've talked about. And also in that research workshop, as well as asking people what are the problems or the challenges cemeteries are up against, we asked them what they thought the solutions might be. What would a future cemetery model be that could address some of these issues that the sector is facing? And we got 5. From the ideas that people put forward, we identified 5 kind of archetypes that people were mixing together to put together their idea of the future cemetery. Now, there are traditionalists, there are people particularly from the kind of religious organizations that we spoke to who do not want the cemetery to change. They want to change as little as possible and are essentially willing to put up with issues such as needing to be further away and so forth, because the traditions are the most important thing to them. There are a strong cohort of people who see the cemetery as a potential nature reserve, nature park, so a place where people are buried, but also a place that's dedicated to the conservation of native flora and fauna, a place where people can go and be in nature, do picnicking and so forth, and sort of be a multiple use space like that. Taking the multiple use space idea even further, some people, a lot of the people we spoke to proposed the idea of these cemeteries in kind of dense neighborhoods in inner cities being socially activated is the term. So essentially that means providing other uses as well as the burial of the dead. Now this is particularly perhaps relevant to cemeteries either where there is a lot of space that has not yet been where people have not yet been buried, or cemeteries where the burials that have taken place have been a relatively long time ago, and so there might be opportunities to kind of reuse that space. So essentially, this could be a cemetery that provides perhaps educational services. There could be a botany community school there, bird watching. There could be art sculptures going up. There could be musical performances. People could perhaps do exercise, a range of uses that you might use that space for. And we saw a little bit of this through last year when the last time we were here in Melbourne, we were locked down within 5 kilometres of our homes. Some people didn't have a lot of park space and started using their local cemetery as a place to just be in a little bit of nature. An idea that is on the fringes in Australia, but has been done overseas, is the idea of the urban high-rise cemetery or columbarium. So essentially, instead of having a rolling green field in which you bury the dead, you have a building. Now, this really challenges our kind of mainstream Australian traditions of what a cemetery or a memorial space would look like. But the benefits of burying or cremating and storing people in an urban building is that it would enable people to be closer to deceased family members, deceased loved ones, close to where they live. They could visit often. So in East Asia in particular, there's a very strong cremation tradition. So there are a lot of columbaria, which is where ashes are stored, which are quite high tech actually. Yeah, that you can kind of go and visit the dead in the middle of the city. And finally, the idea of the digital cemetery. So the digital cemetery that our participants talked about and which we have really focused on is the idea of kind of the technology layer that you put over the top of the physical space of the cemetery to connect this space of headstones and plaques and buried bodies with the digital commemoration practices that are already taking place. As I mentioned, my research team has been studying, other members of the research team have been studying online digital commemoration practices for a number of years. This is a big phenomenon. And in some ways, those commemoration practices are particularly relevant to people's day-to-day lives in a way that the cemetery often may not be, especially if it's far away and hard to get to. So connecting kind of the physical space in a range of ways with online memorialization practices and spaces opens up new possibilities for how people can try to remain engaged with, connected with the loved ones who've passed on. In particular, one of the largest issues which we're really focused on in this research is the idea of remote visitation or virtual visitation of burial sites. I should probably put the word visitation in quotes because the point is you are not actually going there. Again, through these lockdowns in particular, this has really come to the fore. A lot of people who did have a strong connection to the place where perhaps a partner or a family member was buried that they might normally have visited regularly for periods of time have been unable to go to that cemetery and visit and sort of continue that practice of connection. And so there are options that technological options that have been put forward to allow people to kind of replace that or augment that when it's not possible for them to visit for a variety of reasons. A little shout out to Robert Walton, who's a member of the School of Computing and Information Systems, who's done a really interesting piece of work in the digital cemetery space called Vanitas, which is, I've taken a picture from that project in the top right here. It's essentially a sound and kind of app-based exploratory art piece where you walk around the cemetery. Go check that out if that sounds interesting. So this is all at the broad research question, how are digital technologies changing the way that we interact with the cemetery? Note digital technologies though, I think, so just first of all, we've coined the term cemtech to describe these digital technologies. And particularly what we're looking at here is digital technologies that enhance the experience of visiting or interacting with a cemetery. There are many other technologies that are in use at cemeteries for managing the grounds, for digging the holes, for all kinds of things. It's just not the focus of this project at the moment. We're focused on the visitor experience. Yes, but as I say, we are focused on digital technologies, though it's important to remember that the cemetery has already been a digital, has already been a technological space. In many ways, when you look out over a traditional cemetery with headstones and plaques and so forth, you are looking at media, a very information system about the dead, a real resource for genealogists, researchers, and so forth, because it's one of things like headstones are technologies that provide a range of information about people who've passed on, that they may be simple and kind of durable and unchanging, but in a way that is an affordance of that technology, which is very valuable to people. The idea that this record of them is sort of fixed, literally fixed in stone, and will last. This is obviously a big contrast to the sorts of digital technologies we're looking at, where there are no such guarantees in most cases that things will continue on. So that's a big factor. But here you can see sort of an example of a grave that tells a story. It has imagery. It talks about the community, dates, and so forth. There have been a range of other technologies as well. I really don't have time to get into these, but it's just fascinating, so I couldn't resist. One of the most sort of entertaining, morbidly entertaining periods of cemetery history is the 19th century. It is grim, but we're hopefully far enough distant that, you know, I won't offend anyone by talking about this. At the time, there was, in the early 19th century, there was a great demand for fresh human corpses for medical research, medical education, which led to a pretty healthy body snatching industry where people would dig up freshly dug graves. And then in at least some instances, fears around this, which may have been overblown compared to the reality, the prevalence, people would come up with all kinds of mechanisms to prevent people from taking their body or their loved one's body after they're gone. So what you can see here are swivel guns, trap guns that were installed temporarily at grave sites to essentially sort of hidden away, so that when the body snatchers came in to start digging up the grave, the gun would swivel towards them based on a tripwire and maim them. There are all kinds of things. I think that probably one of the most out there is the coffin torpedo, or the alternative grave torpedo, where there was essentially a kind of a booby trap gun built into your coffin, which you could get just for your peace of mind after you're dead, so that as someone was trying to dig you up, a whole bunch of shrapnel would come out and stop them from doing so. The patterns on this are incredible. Anyway, we're here to talk about digital technology. So most of the digital technology that I've encountered in this research has been a lot more chill, a lot more harmonious than these kind of old violent technologies. I think an absolute favorite of the team is the Catacombo sound system, which came out of Sweden, if I'm remembering correctly. Essentially, a hi-fi enthusiast had an entrepreneurial idea to sell people a coffin and a gravestone that were all connected up to Spotify, with speakers built into the coffin, connected to a kind of a wireless hub in the gravestone itself, so that after you die and are buried and are placed in the ground, you can continue listening to your favorite songs. And your loved ones can come along and look at the screen, or perhaps on their app. They can play a song for you to remind you of the good times, and to kind of have that sense that even though you may be dead and buried, you're still sharing sharing music in a certain way, which is a very, very modern form of caring for the dead. This is just one example in a large piece of research we undertook to analyze existing cemetery technologies that people have put forward, designed, built, sold around the world. Just briefly, this work was a kind of a survey of both academic literature and industry publications and a number of sources to identify global examples of cemetery technology, which we then categorized by a number of factors, where they were from, what kind of organization was creating these technologies, whether they'd reached development, whether they were sort of ever accessible, whether they were defunct, and importantly, what they were for. So I'll just give you a kind of a brief recap of what we found, just as a bit of an introduction. The data set I'm talking about here is mostly composed of things that you could go out now and buy or sort of see in the world. That's probably a an artifact of the method, essentially, that I'm sort of going and looking for things that I can find information about. No doubt there are more defunct technologies that have sort of gone by the wayside, but that's the data set. And most of these technologies are coming from private companies, private individuals, although there are about a quarter of them are academic prototypes that you can find in the literature. North America is the biggest source of cemetery technology, although Europe, that we've found, although Europe also has a lot. And as I said, there are really interesting, slightly distinctive cemetery technologies coming out of East Asian countries, particularly Japan. Put those two things together. One interesting observation is that North America has a lot of private entities creating cemetery technology, whereas Europe is a real hub for the academic study and academic prototypes around memorialization and cemeteries as spaces. These technologies are aimed at a range of users. Many of them, as you'd expect, are for friends and relatives of the deceased, but some are for cemetery visitors. Perhaps there are technologies for historical cemeteries where they're essentially tourist sites. Now there are some aimed at researchers, some at industry professionals, and so forth. And they take a range of form factors. Many of them are mobile, on your phone, or something that you wear. Some are essentially online technologies that allow you access to an aspect of the cemetery. Some are installed at the cemetery. Some you have to go to the cemetery and then you access it online, and so forth. So I'll give you a few examples. So first of all, this is the breakdown of the applications that we identified in this 70-odd sort of list of cemetery technologies. The biggest single purpose that these technologies are for is to provide some kind of gravesite media. So to give you an example of what that's like, the catacombo sound system, as I mentioned, that is a form of gravesite media, uniquely in this case for the dead, as well as for the people who are visiting their grave. But a more typical example might be something like this. So this is a company called iTernal, who is the latest in a line of companies to attempt to build a business model out of video screen installations in headstones at cemeteries. So rather than just having, as I showed you before, you know, a stone headstone with a few words on it, you can have video tributes, you can have imagery, you might even have interactive things built right into the gravestone. The majority of this category consists of something that looks a bit more like this. This is a company called Modern. It's a local Australian company that primarily does digitally enhanced urns for cremated ashes, but they also have services where you can put a little digital beacon on a gravestone or another memorial space, and then when you bring your mobile phone into contact with that, into proximity, you can bring up some memorial information about the person. Maybe you can leave digital messages, and so on and so forth. Most cases are even less sort of high tech than this. There are a great number of services that essentially put QR codes on graves to allow you to access an online memorial while you're at the gravesite. Another application that we're particularly interested in is this idea of the soundscape at a cemetery. So one example of a soundscape technology is this piece here called Voices from the Trenches. This is an academic piece by the authors that you can see down the bottom. This came out of the CHI conference a few years ago. What they had was a historical war graveyard in the Italian Alps, which was a tourist site that they augmented with technologies. You walked around carrying this book that you can see with headphones in, and as you move the bookmark to different pages of the book, as you sort of browse through the kind of the history of the place, it would play you different pieces of information. And then some of the more out there ones, again, a small minority of what we're talking about, but perhaps some of the most interesting kind of forward-looking pieces of technology are memorial avatars. One of probably the most advanced version of this is called Dimensions in Testimony. This is a product of the Shoah Foundation, which is a Jewish organization which is dedicated here to preserving the memory of the Holocaust and Holocaust survivors. We're in a really crucial time for Holocaust memory, because the sort of the last cohort of people who were alive to remember the Holocaust, who have been through it, are reaching the end of their lives. And so to try and preserve that experience of being able to actually talk to someone who had been there and to sort of tell you about it in a first-hand way, this project has done three-dimensional recordings of Holocaust survivors being interviewed, answering a range of questions about their experiences and what they knew and what their families went through. And so then when you go and visit this installation, whether it's at a museum or at a memorial site or perhaps at a cemetery, through a sort of an AI conversation system, you can ask questions and then have this representation of a person talking back to you, sort of answering what you wanted to know based on essentially keywords. There is even a hope that one day they could turn it into a 3D hologram, although the technology is not there yet. I've taken quite a long while, so I might try and whip through a couple of these just quickly and then give you one more piece, one more sort of set of data before I throw open to questions. So questions coming up in a little bit. If you have any, please get them ready. But a couple more examples I do want to show you. As I mentioned earlier, the idea of remote visitation is something that's of a lot of interest to us, and technologies that facilitate that. There are a range of interesting examples. So I talked before about the scenario of someone having a personal connection to a burial site and kind of wanting to be there, but not being able to be there for a variety of reasons. Right now, it could be COVID that's preventing them from visiting. Perhaps they live in another city or another country from where their loved one's buried, or perhaps they are infirm. They're not able to travel easily. There is a company called After, AFTR, that has been selling permanently installed webcams, outdoor webcams designed to be affixed to graves, essentially pointed at the grave, so that at any point you can pull up your phone and you can see the gravestone, see how it's doing, you know, have that sense of kind of live personal connection with the gravesite, see if it needs maintenance or cleaning or anything like that. There's also audio that comes through this system, so you can kind of listen if the bird song in this particular cemetery is kind of those sorts of sounds are meaningful to you, then that kind of gives you that connection. And you can even speak back as well through the system, and it sort of has a little speaker that feeds your voice back into the space, so you have that kind of sense of a two-way connection. So that's quite a physical example. And then this here is a fully virtual recreation of another World War II cemetery near a place called Salla, which is on the border between Finland and Russia, where a number of German soldiers were buried towards the end or after the end of World War II. It's very difficult to visit this cemetery now because it is in a border zone, which requires sort of special permission to go and visit. Essentially the Russian government has to allow you to go and visit the site. And so this is an academic project where they recreated the cemetery with virtual enhancements for people to be able to kind of visit remotely and do things like light a candle and place it on a grave wearing a VR headset. And then I think I'll just make this the last one, last example that I'll talk about. This is something that has become very salient again in the last year or so, is this idea of, this is partly about remote visitation of a grave, but specifically hiring someone out via an online service, an online website, to go and tend to a grave, perhaps to put flowers on it, to clean it, to do gardening around it, and then to send you back either photos or, in this case, a full VR recording of this work being done, so that you can remotely have the experience of going and tending to the gravesite, not just visiting, but actually taking care of the gravesite through this sort of virtual channel. There's at least one Australian version of this service. It's sort of starting to pop up all over the place. And during the period of lockdowns, they appear to have had a lot of a bit of a boost as a service. Just briefly, as I mentioned, the sort of those gravesite media, the media installations at graves have been a very popular type of cemetery technology, but a great deal of them have only ever been up to the prototype stage. Maybe they're academic pieces, or they're just a patent. Only a relatively small number have ever actually been live, and then compared to other examples, a relatively high proportion of these technologies that we've found out there on the internet have already gone defunct. They got some news coverage, but they kind of didn't quite take off. And you can kind of see why. It's a difficult thing to sort of sustain interest in. It has challenges. It might be a bit confronting for people. I guess just briefly, again, as I mentioned, there are some regional differences in what cemetery technologies we see popping up in different places. The European examples, which as I mentioned before are also a higher proportion of kind of academic research projects, are a bit more focused on this idea of gravesite media, and also things like soundscapes and kind of more narrative cemetery media. Whereas North America, where kind of the highest proportion of these technologies are coming out of, has been a bit more focused on, you might say, more practical navigation apps, sort of more straightforward walking tour based kind of apps and so forth. We've documented the sort of the particular technologies that have been used in these, which I won't dwell on. And then I just wanted to briefly show you, for those who are interested, we have put together now I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this. Probably can't, given how I'm sharing my screen. This is a website, the Encyclopedia of Cemetery Technology, where we have documented each of these examples. As I said, I think there are 71 listed in there with images and with descriptions and details for people to explore, to be a resource for those who would like to know what are people doing, what sort of applications, all those sorts of questions I've been looking at, what sort of things have been done, what are the components they've used, and so forth. So this is now a kind of an online research resource which we intend to maintain, both for people in the industry, interested people, researchers, and so forth. It's open to contributions as well, as new things arise. All right, and then very briefly now, I'm going to talk about a survey that we recently conducted, which looked at the responses to these sorts of things. So far, I've mostly been talking about what people in the industry think and what people have proposed, what they've made. And here we have attempted to gather some sense of the attitudes that people have to this combination of cemeteries and memorial spaces and digital technologies. So it's a nationally representative sample earlier this year. I'm going to be basically talking about the quantitative questions, although there's a large qualitative component which is still under analysis. One little factoid for you is that Australians strongly favour cremation over other methods of body disposal. Only 18% of people said they'd most like to be buried. And quite a lot of people, almost as many, are actually happy for their body to be donated for research or education purposes. And as I mentioned, there are sort of a few other interesting ways of disposing of your body that we've looked at in previous research. Most people had visited a cemetery in the past year, so it's kind of a rough sense of how prevalent this sort of place is as a place to visit. And in the 12 months before the survey, which essentially is the sort of the initial COVID period, 1 in 8 people in our survey had attended a funeral remotely. And then a third of people had attended a funeral in person. We asked what a cemetery should be used for. As I said, there are these competing visions, these proposals for what we could do with cemetery spaces. And so we put the question to people, okay, a cemetery is a place to inter the dead, that is to bury and commemorate the dead. What else should it be used for? 42% of people said nothing. You should only use a cemetery to inter and commemorate the dead, and that's it. But beyond that block of people, there are a range of things that people thought were good alternative uses, particularly being a nature reserve, being a site of kind of historical interest, tourism, education. And then as you get more into sort of active activities like exercise, theatre performances and so forth, they get less and less popular. And we asked about a range of technologies. We essentially tried to boil down a lot of the examples that I talked about before into kind of simple descriptions of the sorts of digital services that you either might have online for memorialization or in and around the cemetery. And then we asked people's attitudes to that. Just to kind of, as a broad overview, people were generally positive towards the idea of online memorial services. So watching a funeral remotely, most people are quite happy to do that. Having an online memorial page, so kind of a tribute page for people who've died, people are quite comfortable with that. The grave tending service, which I mentioned earlier, generally positive. As you get into things like gravesite webcams installed at the cemetery, people are a bit iffier. There's sort of a bit more of a mixed opinion. And then this idea of a virtual 3D grave is something we were exploring. In fact, our sponsor, the Greater Metropolitan Cemeteries Trust, was exploring the idea of, could we deliver people a virtual recreation of a grave in our cemeteries? And that had, on balance, a sort of somewhat negative response from people. But then when we asked about digital technologies that were designed to be used in and around cemeteries, the response was much sharper. We put in there the idea of sort of essentially an app that helps people explore the cemetery, sort of an audio guide system. Partly this was to see how people would respond to something that we would think is fairly unobjectionable and kind of wholly positive. And as you can see, generally that idea had a positive response. But things like gravestone videos, actually I was a bit surprised by this. The idea of having gravestones that have video screens installed to them was one of the more well received. But when we started describing ideas about having kind of narrative histories installed in the cemetery through speaker systems or through kind of beacon systems where you could go to a point and then listen in to the sort of the history of perhaps the people in this area of the cemetery, this cultural group and so forth. Or perhaps you could listen to speeches or sort of memoirs of people who've died. People got more and more negative about these sorts of ideas. The idea of the augmented reality memorial avatar. Now we didn't put that, essentially what I'm talking about here is the Holocaust memorial avatar type idea, although we didn't put it in a kind of a Holocaust framing. We just said generally, you have a augmented reality system that allows you to kind of have some form of interaction, conversation with a representation of a dead person. People were not generally keen on that. And then just to test the boundaries, we asked about the idea of kind of essentially mobile games that you could play in and around the cemetery. Essentially, I'm thinking about Pokemon Go here, but something slightly more thematically appropriate. Unpopular. And then just to wrap up, the next thing that we're working on at the moment, among other pieces of work, is the idea of trying to illustrate future scenarios of what a cemetery might look like based on everything I've talked about so far. Our team member Samuel Holleran has done these lovely little sketches of some ideas about kind of what it might be like to visit a cemetery or memorial space in the future, and we're getting them illustrated as you can see, and we're going to do user research in the coming months to essentially do focus groups around what people think about these sorts of proposals. All right, I think I've talked well enough, so thank you very much for listening. I hope that has been of interest, and I will throw it open for questions and stop screen sharing. Thank you, Sila. All right, so thanks all for listening. I hope you sort of got some insights out of that and some food for thought. I think we can probably feel free to wrap up there if there are any questions at the moment. I know today's been a tricky day with being the first day of new lockdowns and so forth. So I think a lot of people, a few people have been able to make it. But if you are watching this in a video at a later date, feel free to get in touch with us. Our contact details are at the end there. If you have any questions or would like to know more about this piece of work. All right. Thanks all.